This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, great. So this is where we are. We said what's a virtual network, and we defined a couple of important, or we defined, let's say, a couple of important concepts like what is an address space, and we also said that address spaces are also known as CIDR address blocks. We said it is CIDR address blocks, and we said that virtual network kind of gives you an isolation for the resources in the cloud, meaning your resources are protected from the internet traffic, meaning people on the internet cannot directly come ahead and look into your resources and etc. That's what we discussed about. And then we went inside and we said, okay, fine, there is something known as a subnet, which is nothing but a piece of a virtual network. But inside, you need a subnet for using a virtual network, is what we discussed. And we said, okay, fine, if this is a virtual network, then the subnet address cannot be greater than the address of the parent, which is a virtual network again. So we said how we can divide, let's say, multiple subnets and etc., and how we can create multiple subnets and etc. So let's do that one more time before we go ahead and let's say get into the actual session today. So let me go ahead and create a resource group. So firstly, I'll start with the resource group known as test RG, and we'll create the resource group in ECS2. So I will say it is test RG, and I'm creating this particular resource group in a location called ECS2, and I will say review and create. And once this is created, I will go inside the resource group and I'll say, okay, fine, go ahead, create a virtual network. And I'll just type in virtual network. This will show me all the available options. And the question is, can you create a subnet directly? No, you cannot create a subnet directly, but you cannot create a virtual network without creating a subnet inside it. So you'll have to say create a virtual network, and only then you'll have the option to go ahead and create a subnet. So that's the logic behind it. So right now I'm saying, okay, fine, the name of the virtual network is something like test vnet storage. I'm saying it is ECS2. And then I'm saying, okay, fine, the address space of the virtual network. Let's take a different address space today. This is something that we were doing. And can anyone tell me what class of a virtual network I'm creating here? We were talking about the RFC 1918 standards, right? So can anyone tell me what class of a virtual network is this?
Class
Is it
A.
class? Exactly. It's a class A virtual network that we are creating. And this is the largest virtual network that you can have, meaning you can go up till 10.0.0.8. It's valid. You can take this. So what I'll do is like I'll now take a class C virtual network, not a class A. I'll say it is 192.168.0.0 forward slash 16, and this is a valid address space. And can anyone help me what can be the CIDR of the subnet? Let's say this is subnet 1. Can anyone tell me what should I use for the subnet, guys? Can anyone help me with this? Any one of you all guys? What can be the address space of the subnet? Anyone? Can I take this as 10.0.0.0 forward slash 24? Is this acceptable, guys? Anyone? Anyone, guys? Can I say that the subnet 1 is 10.0.0.0 forward slash 24? Yes, no, maybe.
No,
So, what can be the address space here?
it has to be inside 192.168
That's correct.
0.0.
192.168.0.0 forward slash 24. I'll hit 24 address space, which is inside the address space of the virtual network. It has a 16. So the subnet should be greater than 16. So it can be 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, so on and so forth. But the question here is, yes, great, 24 is working. Can I do a 25? 25 will also work. I'm getting 123 plus 5. This is important. This plus 5 address here, right? It's saying 123 plus 5 Azure reserved addresses. Meaning, for each and every subnet that you're creating, Azure is taking up 5 IP addresses. Any cloud provider, not only Azure, be it Azure, AWS, GCP, any subnet that you create, the cloud provider, the cloud provider will reserve 5 addresses. Now, why is this? Why do they reserve it? Now, there is something known as communication broadcasting, meaning inside a virtual network, you need your resources to talk to each other, right? For that, the cloud provider takes in somewhere around 2 IPs. They take, okay, fine, I need 2 IPs for this. One IP to provide an address to you. That, okay, fine, this is an address where one particular resource sits in. So you have 3 completed here. And 2 IPs, they say, is for future purposes. Let's say they want to implement something. Let's say a cloud provider wants to implement an additional security layer and etc. for which they need an address. And if they don't reserve this, they might not roll that update to your particular tenant. They might not be able to do that for your tenant and etc. So for any address that you create, no matter how small it is or how big it is, the cloud provider by default will occupy 5 addresses. They say, okay, fine, we need 5 addresses. So these 5 IPs are not usable. So when I take a 24 address space, I don't get 256, but rather I get 251 plus 5 Azure reserved addresses. I would say I get 251 because 251 are my usable addresses plus 5 IPs that are reserved by Azure. So if I go by this concept, the interview questions are, then what is the smallest subnet address space that you can create? Let's say I go for 25, accepting. It says 123 plus 5 Azure reserved IPs. If I do a 26, it says 59 plus 5 Azure reserved IPs. If I say 27, it's still getting created, 27 plus 5. 28 is still accepted, 11 plus 5. 29 is still accepted because it is 32 minus 29, meaning 2 to the power of 32 minus 29, which gives me 2 to the power of 3, which gives me 8 IPs, out of which Azure is taking 5. So I have 3 IPs that are left. But can I do a 30 right now? It's saying, okay, fine, the prefix must be smaller than or equal to 29. So 29 is the smallest subnet that you can have. The reason being, if I go for 30, it will be 2 power 32 minus 30, which will give you 2 power 2, 4 IPs, out of which Azure now wants to take out 5. So you cannot have a minus 1 here, right? That's the reason the smallest IP that you can have, or the smallest CIDR address block that you can have for a subnet is a /29. This is the smallest address that you can have, or this is the smallest address block that you can have for a subnet. Guys, did you all understand this concepts? Any questions here? Anyone, guys? Any questions here? Okay. So I'll say, okay, fine. This is 24. So 192.168.0.04/24 is the address. And finally, when I come here, there is a concept known as service endpoints. This concept comes in when I'm adding a subnet. Now, what exactly is service endpoint is very simple at this point. Just understand that you have a storage account inside this particular isolation. So you're creating a virtual network now to protect your resources. So I am saying, okay, fine, let's go ahead and create a storage account, attach that particular storage account to the subnet. And now I am saying I'll get in a concept known as service endpoint. Now, the concept basically, if you have to understand this concept, we'll have to just slightly go back to something known as the Azure data centers in the world. What happens is that if I just talk about Azure data centers, and if I look at the global infrastructure of Azure, now they say this is all the infrastructure and etc. And you'll also have an Azure data center map. So let's come back and let's see images. And this is the image that I want to focus upon. Let's come down and let's see. This is the map what Azure really has right now, meaning Azure has so many data centers across the world. It says there are about 50 regions that are worldwide according, and then it says, okay, fine, there is so many data centers basically out here across different parts of the world and etc. And Azure really says that, okay, fine, these data centers, which are my own data centers, are connected by cables. Like one data center is technically connected to each other. So all the data centers are connected, all the data centers of the world are internally connected by physical cables. By physical cables out here. Now, Microsoft Azure says that these physical cables is what I have laid down, meaning these physical cables is something that I am provisioning right now. And these physical cables are not the internet line, are not the internet lines. Internet has different cables and etc. This is intranet, meaning internal only to my organization. My organization as in Microsoft. Now, Azure asks you, okay, fine, you have laid down something known as these cables and etc. That is great. So I have an internet, meaning everything that people use, and I have something known as intranet, only which Microsoft or only which, let's say, resources and people of Microsoft use it. So what is the advantage of an intranet? It is more secure, it is more faster than the internet. So Azure is telling you, okay, fine, you are now protecting resources, let's say using a virtual network. Now, if a user wants to come, let's say, and visit the storage account, I'm a user, I want to now start using the storage account service. So if I come here and want to use the storage account service, should I be using the internet to hit your storage account? Or should I be using the cables that Azure has laid down? Like, how should my request go in? This is where service endpoint comes into picture. Now, when you enable service endpoint in a subnet, it asks you, okay, fine, for which service that you want to enable service endpoint for. It says, okay, fine, service endpoint. And since I'm dealing with storage accounts, I'll say it is Microsoft.storage and I'll say add. Now, if I go into my subnet, it'll say, okay, fine, you have a service endpoint here for Microsoft.storage, meaning now Azure will identify that whoever now comes, let's say, and wants to request for, let's say, the data inside the storage account should be diverted not through the internet, but through the intranet, meaning through the cables which I have laid or the cables which I have laid down. The traffic should go through those cables out here. This is the difference between internet and intranet. Now the access to your resources are more secure, are more faster when you use these Microsoft cables. And all this network, right, is known as a Microsoft backbone. These are known as Microsoft backbone or backend networks out here. Guys, is everyone following? Any questions here? Like what this is and etc. Any questions here, guys? Okay, great. So now I'll say, okay, fine, I need a service endpoint so that the traffic from the internet, I mean from the traffic basically from a user, is diverted not through the internet, but it's diverted through an intranet, and I'll say save. So service endpoints, very importantly, are enabled at the subnet level. And I'll say, okay, fine, review and create this out. So I'm not tagging my resources. The only thing that I put in are the basic details, which is like the name of the storage account, which is, let's say, the resource group in which the storage account sits in. So not the storage account, the virtual network. So the resource group in which the virtual network sits in, the name of the virtual network, and also the IP addresses. Like what is the address space of the virtual network and what is the address space of the subnet. And I'm using a class C network right now. And I'll say review and create. So let me go ahead and now create this out. And once created, I'm just creating a virtual network right now. So once created, what I'll do is that I'll now take a storage account and I'll now place the storage account inside the created virtual network. So I am securing my resource in that way. So let's give this one quick minute out here to get created. And in between, does anyone have any questions, guys? Is anyone not following this concept? Please let me know because this is like quite important. Anyone, any questions, guys? Okay, so we have the resource created. Let's go into the virtual network. And right now I have different options out here, like the overview page, where it tells me what is the resource group in which I have created this, the location that I've created this in, the offer. I'm now using a free trial account, so it's telling it's a free trial. And then it's telling me, okay, fine, the subscription ID. And then I have a couple of things like the address space, and then let's say it's saying the DNS that Azure provides and etc. We'll speak about this a bit later. And then if I go into something known as subnets, it says I have a subnet here. And if I just click on this particular subnet, it also says that, okay, fine, there is a service endpoint that I have enabled for a service known as what? Microsoft.storage. As you suggested, I have enabled this particular service. And even the service endpoint, it says create the service endpoint policies to allow traffic to specific Azure resources from your virtual network over our service endpoints, meaning over, let's say, the Azure backbone network. And if you want to read more about this particular service endpoints, you can just say learn more, and it'll take you to the Microsoft documentations and explain you a lot of things about the service endpoints out here. It says, okay, fine, this is what the service endpoint is, and it simply tells you that the virtual network service endpoints provide secure and direct connectivity to Azure resources over an optimized route over the Azure backbone network. This is important. So I said, okay, fine, the service endpoint is enabled. I'll say save, great. And I have a couple of things like the firewall and etc., which we'll be seeing in later in the coming classes. And once this is saved, so I haven't done any change. Once this is saved, I'll just go back to home, and now I'll say storage account, and I don't have any storage account, so I'll just go ahead and say create a storage account right now. I'll say this is the resource group known as test RG, and I'll say storage account name is something like healthcare, something like this. And I'll say now, very importantly, guys, please understand this question, and please, even if you're, I mean, even if you give a wrong answer, I'm okay with that. My virtual network is in East US 2. Can I create my storage account in a location like North Europe and attach it with my virtual network? Yes, no, maybe.
Yes, we can do it.
Okay, so let's try that. So I'll say my virtual network, or let's say my storage account that I'm creating right now, is in, let's say, North Europe. So let's see, let's type in North Europe. I'll say this is LRS. Advanced, I'm not doing anything. In networking, I directly want to attach this storage account with the virtual network that I created even before creating the storage account out here. So I'll say it is not public endpoints all networks. It is public endpoint selected. And now it's asking me, okay, fine. Can you please select what is your subscription? I'll say it is free trial because this is where I went ahead and created the virtual network in. And then it says, okay, fine. Can you please select your virtual network? And I don't see this option at all. It's not showing me the option at all. The reason being, you cannot have the virtual network and the resource that you're attaching with the virtual network in different locations. Virtual network are regional resources. These are regional in nature. Meaning, if this is in East US 2, the resources that you want to attach to this particular virtual network should also stay in East US 2. If this is sitting in a different location, it will fail to attach that particular resource to that particular virtual network. So virtual network are very regional in nature. Unlike the resource group can sit in any different location, not a problem. But if you want to integrate a virtual network with a service like a storage account in our case, you will have to have the virtual network and the subnet, of course, and the resource, all these three things in the same region. Until this, you won't be able to go ahead and do the integration out here. So that's the reason when I selected a region like North Europe and when I went into the networking, it's not showing any virtual network at all. But I do have a virtual network that is sitting in this particular subscription known as free trial. But that particular virtual network is sitting in a region called as East US 2. So what I'll do here is I'll just come back. I'll just, to test out my theory, I'll just change my location to East US 2 and I'll say advanced networking and I'll say, okay, fine. Please select this. And now I'm able to see the test vnet hyphen storage, what we have said, what we have created out here. The reason being the virtual network and the virtual network and the storage account are sitting inside the same region. Guys, does that answer? So you need your virtual network, which is regional in nature, and the resources that are sitting in this. So both of them should sit in the same region out there. Any questions here, guys? So I said, okay, fine. Please select this particular virtual network. And it's now asking me, okay, great. You have selected a virtual network. Can you please select a subnet? Since I have only one subnet here, it is just showing me this particular subnet out here. And finally, I'll say data protection, like this is okay. I'll say finally review and create. It says I'm running the final validation. And once this is done, I'll go ahead and hit create upon this particular storage account out here. And when this is getting created or when this is created, this storage account will directly get integrated to the virtual network resource. So I am now creating a storage account not just on the free internet, but I am creating a storage account inside the intranet, meaning you can only connect to the storage account provided if you come through this virtual network only. You won't be able to connect to the storage account from the internet traffic. This is how I am enabling a firewall protection against my storage account and making sure that my data is safe and sound. This is the concept of virtual network integration with a storage account, and why do you do it, how do you do it, and etc. And these are the concepts of virtual networks. So any questions here, guys? Anything, anyone?
So every resource group where we create in a different location or different region, the networks
Mhm.
also will be differing according to it. Wherever the networks are, there we will be able to create the resource groups as well, right?
So no, so the point is that a resource group is a different entity. Like resource group is here. So you have a resource group out here. Let me take out the image of a resource group. So resource group holds all these things, right? So it holds your virtual network subnets and let's say the resources inside it. Resource group is just like a folder. Now when I go into my resource group called test RG, this is the resource group and it has a resource inside it. Now the point here is that the resource group can be in a different location. This is not a problem. This can be in a different location. I can do a North Europe. But my virtual network can be in a different location. That is not a problem. But the thing is that if I have a storage account and I want to connect the storage account or I want to integrate the storage account with the virtual network that I'm created, the storage account should be in the same region as the virtual network is. So the location of the resource group and the location of the resources that it holds can be different. But if you want to connect a virtual network with any of the service, in our case it is a storage account, they both have to be in the same location out here. Does that answer your question, Farin?
Yes, yes, I got it. Thank you.
Right. So a resource group is nothing but a placeholder. That's it. It just holds your resources. That's it. And finally, when I said, okay, fine, go ahead and create a storage account out here. Now I have a storage account sitting in an RG known as test RG in a location called EastUS2. It is in standard LRS storage V2 and etc. And if I now come down into something known as networking, it's now not accessed or it's now not accessible from all the networks, but it's accessible only from selected networks. And that particular selected network is the test storage or test VNet, that is storage, and inside which only one particular subnet or only one particular subnet basically can access all the data inside this particular storage account. This is how I made sure to enable something known as a protection for my storage account, because the data that you sit in here or the data that you put in here is very sensitive, is very customer centric. So it shouldn't be available to all the people. It shouldn't be available, let's say, to everyone who's coming from the internet. This is the concept, guys. Guys, any questions that I can take here before we move ahead? Anyone not following this, anything, please do let me know. I'll be more than happy to help you all with the concept that you haven't followed. Anyone, anything, guys? Okay. So moving forward, then this is great. This is good. But how do I automate this out? Like meaning the other class when we just began this virtual networks and etc. We were using ARM templates, right? We said, okay, fine, we'll go ahead and do ARM templates. And we said this is one of the best ways to go ahead and let's say provision your resources. Now I want something like this, guys. I need an ARM template for me, but this ARM template should not just create the storage account. Now, on the other day, we said, okay, fine, we'll create an ARM template to create multiple storage accounts, single storage account, and etc. But in my case, right now, the ARM template should do a couple of things. The ARM template should firstly create a virtual network for me and then create a subnet inside that virtual network. And finally, 2, it should create a storage account and it should add this particular subnet on the firewall of the storage account. This is what it should try to do. This is what my end goal is. So VNet, then a storage account, and both connected together. This is the end goal that I'm trying to do out here. So let's try to do that. So I have my VS Code open and I have selected the language as ARM. So I am inside this particular ARM block. And guys, anyone can y'all help me? What is the first thing that I should write here in order to start writing an ARM template?
ARM.
Exclamation, right? So I'll say it is ARM. And as soon as this loads, I get this out. And when we started off with our classes, we here in the resources said it is ARM-storage. Now what I want to do is that I want to first create a virtual network because I'm trying to integrate or I'm trying to place my storage account inside a virtual network. For this, I need a virtual network to be existing, right? I need a virtual network and a subnet to be existing. So what I'll do here is I'll say it is ARM and I'll say VNet. And I have a resource known as VNet out here, which is a virtual network. And I'll say great, enter. Now it says, okay, fine. You know what? You have asked me to create a virtual network. So I have a virtual network out here. And these are the important things out here. Firstly, it's asking me for the name of the virtual network. Secondly, secondly, it's telling the type. And earlier, right, when we were creating a storage account, the type here was Microsoft.storage/storage accounts. But here my type has changed, meaning this is the resource identifier, as we said, which helps Azure to understand what kind of a resource are you really trying to create out here. So I'm saying the type here is a Microsoft.network/virtual networks. And I'm saying, okay, fine, this is the virtual network that I'm creating. And then it says there's something known as an API version. It's taken the latest API version out here. And then it says location. And I'm saying wherever I'm creating the resource group, please go ahead and grab that location, which is good for me. I'll say great. But what I'll do here is that since my name or since let's say my template should be reusable, I will parameterize a couple of things. I'll say it is virtual network name and I'll put a parameter here and I'll say the type of the parameter is a string and the default value of this particular parameter, I'll say it is a storage VNet. I'll say, okay, fine. Since I've given the name in the parameters, let me go ahead and change this. And I'll say it is parameters virtual network name. I am parameterizing a couple of things out here. Finally, I say, okay, fine. The location is, let's say resource group dot location, wherever is the resource group that I'm trying to deploy this particular virtual network into. Please take the same resource group and take the location of that particular resource group wherever it is. I don't care. So please take the location of the resource group and create the resources out here. Then tags not a mandatory parameter. You can leave this. It's just optional. Finally, properties very important. And inside properties, you have something known as address space. This is the address space of the virtual network. So I'm saying the address is something like 10.0.0.0/16, which is a class A address, which is the largest address that is available out there. And after the address space, I am now mentioning subnets. And subnets is an array of resources, meaning not one, not two. You can create multiple subnets inside this. Right now, they have two subnets out here. They've given you two subnets out here. I can say I'll just remove the subnet to avoid confusions. I just need just one particular subnet. So I'm saying this is just one subnet. And I will also say I need a parameter name for the subnet name. So I'll say subnet name, take a parameter for this particular name. Say the type here is a string again, and the default value is a storage subnet. And coming down, I'll just parameterize this. I'll say this parameters subnet name. This is the entire virtual network block. So I'll just save this out and I'll say it is vnet storage JSON, and I'm just saving this out right now. Guys, are we good here? Anything do you feel that I'm missing on? Does anyone feel that I'm missing anything here? Can we go ahead and use
Resource,
this? I'm sorry. Yes, please go ahead. Can I start using this template?
resources group, resource group name.
Okay, but resource group name is something that you cannot define in the ARM. Like resource group is something that you select while deploying this template using PowerShell or let's say the custom deployment on the portal. But
Got
what we are yeah, okay, so what we are using this particular VNet for, so that later we can attach a storage account to it, right? We want to protect a storage account using this particular virtual network. And I said that when I created on the portal, I created a virtual network, and while I was creating the subnet, I made sure to go ahead and enable something known as a service endpoint for Microsoft.storage. Now, one very important thing out here, guys, is that you will not be able to attach a storage account to a virtual network until and unless you enable this something known as service endpoint. When you're coming in a programmatic way, meaning when you're using a PowerShell or let's say when you're using an ARM template like the way we are doing today, you will not be able to attach a virtual network to a storage account until and unless the virtual network or the subnet inside that particular virtual network has something known as a service endpoint enabled. Then how do I enable this out then? If that's the case, then how do I enable this? So let's come back again, and inside the address prefix, or let's say inside the subnet basically, because this is where you need to enable things out. I'll just put a comma here after address prefixes, and I'll just say okay fine. Just say service endpoints, and I'll say okay fine, this is the service endpoint, and I'll say the service that I need is a Microsoft dot storage. This is how I am declaring the service endpoint. And since the service endpoint is created inside a subnet, I went inside the subnet and I went inside the properties of the subnet, the comma after the address prefix, and I said, okay, fine, this is the service endpoint that I need. And the type of the service that I need for the service endpoint is a Microsoft dot storage. Finally, I'll just say save my template. So let's do this. Let's save this out. And let's only deploy this particular template, like just a VNet and a subnet, and see how they are getting created. And after they are created, let's finally go ahead and add a storage account to it. So I'm coming here into the Azure portal. I'll go into something known as custom deployments. So I'll say deploy a custom template. And as and when this loads, I'll say, okay, fine, I'll build my own template. I'll say load my file. And let me go into my drive, ARM storage networking, and this is the file that I want to load out. and this is loaded. I'll say save, and here I'll just go ahead and create a new resource group. I'll just say this is storage ARM networking. This is what I'm creating. I'm creating a VNet. I'm creating a subnet, and this is the name of the virtual network in a subnet that's being picked up from, let's say, the default values. I'll say review and create. I'll say create. So this will take a minute or two. Let's come back. Until then, let's go back to our template. And from line number 17 to line number 42 is where, let's say, your first resource is getting created at. Meaning this is the virtual network. Now you also want to make sure that a storage account is also created inside this particular template, and that storage account should be integrated with the virtual network that you created above. Okay, this is what I'm trying to do with the template. So what I'll do is that at line number 43, I'll just put a comma, just say enter. I'll say ARM hyphen I need a storage. I'm now creating a storage account. So this is how we created the storage account, isn't it? And I'll also make sure to parameterize the storage account name. So I'll say storage account name. It's a string. And let's say I'll give a default value, something like dev store abc 000 US East 5 or 6 or something like this, so that the name can be unique. And I'll use this particular name inside my template known as parameters storage account name. Finally, finally I say it's resource group dot location, and I'll just hard code this value as standard LRS and tier as standard. Now I'm just hard coding a couple of values out here. Now, is this storage account block okay, guys? Does anyone has any issues with this? Am I missing anything here? Do you feel that I'm missing anything here?
Virtual network we need to mention, right?
Yes. Yes. So what is the issue there? So I mentioned the virtual network. Yes, great. So I'm creating the virtual network, but you say that I haven't integrated it with the virtual network, right? Guys, does anyone have any concerns with this particular template? So one thing out here is that I want to basically go ahead and create a storage account. That's right. I also want to make sure to integrate the storage account with the virtual network that I'm creating above. So I'm creating a VNet in the same template, and I want to make sure that whenever the storage account is being created, it needs to get connected with this particular virtual network and with the particular subnet inside the particular virtual network. And it needs to make sure that it's protected. This is what I need, right? So let's go back one quick time to our deployment. Let's see what got created firstly. So if I go into, let's say, this the resource group, I just have a storage account so I just have a virtual network that got created. And this virtual network is sitting in a 10.0.0.0/16 address space. If I come into the subnets, I have a subnet known as storage-subnet, which is 10.0.0.24. And if I go into the subnet, I have a service endpoint that is enabled. So this setup is okay. Like first point is done. But the second thing is that I need to make sure that a storage account is created now. And this particular storage account automatically is added a firewall rule, meaning the storage account basically is not exposed to the internet, but should be integrated directly with the subnet inside the created VNet, inside the VNet that we created above. So this is the idea. What I'm going to do out here is I'll say now my template that okay, fine. Before you go ahead and create this particular storage account, please make sure that this virtual network already exists, because at a later point in time, I will make sure to integrate the storage account with the VNet. So now it becomes very important for you to tell a template, for you to tell to your template that which resource do you deploy first, or which resource that you create first. How do I tell it? Is that I'll say, okay, fine, this creation of the storage account, and I'll use a condition known as depends on. It depends on, and I can, this is an array. I'll just close this array here. And I'm telling that, okay, fine, the creation of this particular storage account will always depend upon the particular virtual network that's being created above. If you find this virtual network good enough, go ahead and please create my storage account. Otherwise, please do not create it. And the way I'm declaring it, I'm using a function known as resource ID. I'm telling, okay, fine. It will definitely depend upon a resource ID known as Microsoft.network/virtual networks, comma, parameters virtual network name. If you find this resource ID, if you find the ID, meaning the template will only able to find the ID if it is created, and this is how the ID looks like. Let's go into something known as properties, and you have something known as a resource ID here. If I copy this out, this is how the resource ID will look like. It says this is the subscription which is created in. This is the resource groups under which, let's say, the virtual network is getting created in. This is the provider, which is Microsoft.network/virtual networks, and this is the virtual network that got created. And I'm saying, okay, fine. If you see this string, meaning this will only happen, or this will only get produced when the template first creates a virtual network. That's the reason I'm saying please make my template dependent upon the virtual network that's being created. And finally, I would say, okay, fine, after the SKU is getting closed, I'll say comma. I'll say something known as properties. I'll say going inside the property, I'll say something like, okay, fine, you know what? Open up something known as network ACLS. Very, very, very important. This is, let's say, the firewall rules, or basically this is something which will help you add a firewall rule and etc. I'll say please add the network ACL. I'll say okay, great. And it has a couple of things out here like what is the default action, etc. I'll say by default, please go ahead and deny the traffic. Default, please go ahead and deny the traffic from the internet, and make sure to allow a particular virtual network. So I'm saying, okay, fine, please make sure to allow a particular virtual network out here. And I'll say, okay, fine, action is allow. And the ID of the virtual network is again the same. Say resource ID of, let's say, no, I'm not giving the ID of the virtual network. I'm directly telling which subnet it should sit in. Because the storage account doesn't get attached to the virtual network, it gets attached to the subnet of the virtual network. So I'm saying this is a subnet, comma parameters VNet name, comma parameters the subnet name. This is how I am picking up the ID out here. And I can also go ahead and give an IP address here. I can say IP rules. I can say, okay, fine, these are the IP rules out here. I can say action is allow, and I can give my IP address here. I can just pick up my IP address from Google. This is the IP address where I'm sitting in. I can place my IP address here also. And this is an array, so you can place multiple IP addresses inside it. Finally, I'll say save. Take this out, same template. Go to a custom deployment again. So deploy a custom template. So build your own template. Is this template out? I'll say save. Finally, I'll say, okay, fine. This is the resource group that I want to basically create this service in. And I have given all the values here. Let me do a validation and let me say create these resources. So very importantly, guys, there are a couple of things that I've added here. The very first of everything is a virtual network and a subnet inside the virtual network. And this virtual network is the first resource to be created. So I haven't added something known as a depends on parameter at all. I said, okay, fine, we are good. It doesn't depend upon this resource creation, doesn't depend upon anything else. Then I said, okay, fine, this is a storage account. And this storage account should only be created if you have a pre-existing virtual network. It said, great, not a problem, I'll do that. And then I said, added something known as a property. And inside the property, I added something known as ACL, which is network ACLS, meaning it will say, okay, fine, what networks have the access and what do not. And I said by default, please deny all the traffic, but make sure to allow the traffic from this particular subnet and my IP address. This is how I have constructed an end-to-end template, which will help me achieve these two things. One, adding a virtual network. Second, integrating the virtual network with a storage account. And finally, you have the template that got deployed. And if you look at it, I just have two resources. I have a virtual network with subnets inside it. And inside a subnet, I have, let's say, the service endpoint basically that's got added. Secondly, I have, let's say, something like a storage account. And if I now go into the networking of the storage account, it's denying all the traffic because I enabled a parameter known as deny here. I said, please make sure to deny all the traffic here by default. And then I said, okay, fine, great. After you deny, please make sure to allow this particular virtual network and this particular IP address. This is how I made sure to write my entire template, guys. Guys, any questions here? Anything that I can take? Any questions as such? Anyone, anything?
Yeah, yeah. Actually, that storage account subnet uh, uh, complete for the all subnets. I mean, what are the? I'm a little bit confusion about the here.
Will it complete for the all subnets? As in, I am not sure. I didn't follow
Yeah, if
you.
we have
Can
a
you
sub,
please?
if you create a three four subnets,
Yes.
so yeah, okay. The what are the storage we account we have created in the virtually?
Hmm.
So these those are all subnets will be share the same storage account. I
No,
mean,
they won't share the same storage account. You will
okay.
have to. How did I do it? Is that I said that only this particular subnet needs
Mhm.
to make sure to have access onto that particular storage account. In the same way, if you have a different subnet, right? Let's say you're creating a different subnet. Let's do that. Let's just copy this block. I'll say this is subnet 1. I'll say this is 10.0.1.0/24. And I'm just giving a name for this particular subnet here. I'll say the default value is something like subnet 1 hyphen storage. And this is where your second subnet gets created. Now, if you want that particular subnet also to make sure to be whitelisted onto this particular storage account, or if you want that particular subnet to also have an access to this particular storage account, what I'll do is add another rule here saying allow. And this time I'll say, okay, fine. The ID is something like resource ID of Microsoft.storage account /subnets, parameters virtual network name, and parameters subnet 1. Now both the subnets that get created will now have access over the storage account. So you'll have to explicitly mention here in this way. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Any more questions here, guys? Anything, anyone? Sorry, anything, anyone, guys? Okay, then if there are no further questions, guys, we're good to close the session today. And even tomorrow's session would be online, so we'll meet tomorrow and we'll discuss more on virtual networks and etc. Thank you, guys, and have a great day ahead.